Today, I want to talk about the decision to quit competing in mixed martial arts in the UFC or in other events. And clearly, this has been brought on, or this thought has been brought on by watching the Tito Ortiz Chuck Liddell fight, but this applies so many different places. I've watched a lot of fighters go through their career arcs from stages when they're bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and just starting out and wanting to train every single day to achieving some level of dominance in the sport, and then the long, often slow decline down the other side. And it's a really sad thing to watch. But there's a big difference between watching MMA guys go through their career arc and, say, watching it like a tennis guy. A tennis guy eventually is going to slow down, eventually is going to quit. You know, his speed will become slower, his shoulder will start bugging him, his knees will give out, he'll grind the cartilage in his hips to dust, but he's not going to come down with permanent brain damage. If he should have retired doing tennis and he keeps on doing tennis, there's not going to be a permanent deficit to him other than orthopedic stuff. Who he is going to remain fundamentally the same. And they can replace hips, they can replace knees. At some point, they'll be able to replace shoulders, but they can't yet replace brains. And once brains are damaged, once that tau protein and the amyloid beta protein and the various tangles of Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease and chronic traumatic encephalopathy start kicking in and start screwing up your brain function, well, then it's too late. You can't go, oh, you know what? I'm going to dial that all back. I'm going to retire 3 years earlier than I was going to retire. It's too late. Brain damage is permanent and it's cumulative. The more shots you take, the more damage there is. And unfortunately, the longer you've been fighting in MMA, probably the more shots you're going to take because you're already on that downward decline. There was a study a bunch of years ago that showed that MMA fighters peaked 9 years after they started fighting MMA. The way I always think about this, it doesn't mean that you can only peak at age 18 plus 9, which is age 27. No, might be true if you started fighting at age 18, and now it's been a number of years since that study has been, so maybe that time has shifted. But Randy Couture started fighting when he was 36, and he kind of peaked when he was in his mid-40s. So the last data that I'm aware of shows that there's about a 9-year arc between starting MMA and the best level that you're ever going to get to. Trouble is, there's a lot of guys, Tito, Chuck, and lots of other people that you've seen who keep on coming back, who keep on getting ready for one more fight, who keep on putting it on the line. And it's easy to understand. I mean, quite honestly, a lot of these guys spent so much time training and so much time sparring and so much time developing their skills as a fighter that they didn't develop other skills. They didn't develop, the ability to sell cars and then start a used car dealership. They didn't develop the ability, they didn't go and get their civil engineering degree at the same time as they were fighting MMA. And now that they've retired from MMA, they can make a decent living being a civil engineer. A lot of these guys, not all of them, but a lot of these guys, their only asset is their ability to get out there, swing for the fences, try takedowns, try to go for the submission, and try and win, or at least show up for MMA fights. But it can't be emphasized enough that MMA is fundamentally super dangerous. Nobody is out there saying that it's a safe sport. It's super dangerous. And yeah, the odds that you die in are fairly slim, but wait till the brain damage, wait till the CTE data starts coming in a few years from now, a decade from now. And again, the problem is that the studies show that your brain starts taking damage before you start showing it. You might not be aware that the damage has already started. But if they were to take you, freeze you, slice your brain open, and look for the protein tangles, they would find the protein tangles. They would show the damage already beginning to occur. So you don't want to be that guy. You really, really don't want to be that guy who has no choice other than to keep on fighting. I mean, Mike Tyson had an amazing boxing career. But then for the last 12 or so of his fights, he was just dialing it in, calling it in, right? He had like 5 wins out of his last 12 fights. And we still talk about him today as one of the greatest heavyweights of all time, maybe the greatest heavyweight boxer of all time. Certainly one that is in the popular imagination more than any other boxer. If I say Tyson, everyone knows who I'm talking about. Everyone, including people who don't follow boxing. Everyone knows who Mike Tyson is. But we got to remember that he had that long, slow decline in the career arc. Maybe Mayweather's there too. Mayweather keeps on taking these novelty fights or negotiating for these novelty fights. I mean, he spends a ton of money on his lifestyle. What's his nickname again? Yeah, Money Mayweather. And when you see his entourage and the style that he rolls in, he's spending. His burn rate's got to be insane. Maybe that's why he's taking these ridiculous fights. Fights with Conor McGregor, fights in Japan against potential fights in Japan against really good kickboxers. It's a dangerous time. So we've been talking about people who are champions or at an ultra elite level within the sport and reaching a certain point, a certain high point in apogee, and then beginning to go downhill after that. But what about the people who are never going to make it there? The tomato cans, right? The gatekeepers, the Gary Goodridges of the world. One fantastic knockout on the UFC and then some other fights made Gary Goodridge the gatekeeper for Pride. Where's he at now? Taking a ton of medication and barely able to remember his own name. You don't want to be that guy either. So how's it possible to tell whether you're going to be that guy? If you've been fighting, say for 5 years, and you've got a win-loss record of 50-50, should you keep on fighting? Maybe it's the case that you just haven't had the right coaching. Maybe it's the case that you had really unlucky draws and you just ended up going against super good guys. Or maybe it's the case that you just don't have what it takes. You just don't have the speed, the reflexes, the ability to endure more training, the ability to process information fast enough. Whatever those tangible and intangible attributes are of successful fighters, maybe you don't have that. And if you don't have that, it's time for you or someone close to you to do the math and to figure out, like, look, I know you enjoy it. I know you love going in there and slugging it out. And I know you love the paycheck, but you better stop, right? I'm of the opinion that if you don't think you can be great, you shouldn't do it. Not for that sport. I mean, if you're an avid cross-country skier and you know you're never going to go to the Olympics, that's great. Keep on cross-country skiing. If you're an avid archer and you know you're never going to go to the World Archery Championships, if there is such a thing, you know you're never going to be able to go to the Olympics, that's fine. You're unlikely to damage yourself. It always comes back, for me, to the damage to the brain. Is it worth it? Because it is going to happen. Even if you don't get hit in fights, you are getting hit in sparring. And there's some data to suggest that it's actually the shots you take in sparring, the lighter shots, the more repeated shots, that end up doing damage. So if you've been in it for a while, you got to ask yourself, are you doing this because you really love doing it, or are you doing it for the paycheck? There's nothing sadder. There's nothing sadder than watching a fighter who used to love it, who used to love training twice a day, used to love the grind, go, oh, I got to fight in 6 weeks. Shit. I better start doing some road work and hitting some pads. Because he's not going to be in peak shape. 6 weeks is not enough for 99.99% of fighters to hit a training camp and then do all right in the ring. And remember, doing all right might mean winning, but it might also mean ducking those 10, 15, 20 shots to the head, to slip, bob, weave, evade, parry, counterattack all those shots that you would have eaten. So training isn't only to win a fight. Training is to not take too much damage during the fight. So there's nothing worse than fighters who have no other way of making money, who have to go and fight, right? Even though they used to fight for $30,000, now they're fighting for $5,000. But you know what? $5,000 cash, with $1,000 to their manager, it's still $4,000 in the pocket. It's still a pretty easy way to make money. It's kind of like the stripper paradox, right? A young, hot stripper starts in the really high-end clubs. Then she's been stripping 5, 10 years. She's going to be working the middle to low-end clubs. If she stays in the sex industry for another 10, 15 years, she's going to be working the corner. I'm not saying all strippers turn into prostitutes, but that would be the arc, right? Stripping and fighting is one where if you stay in it too long, you're going from the height of the sport down to the lower reaches of the sport. I mean, by the end of his career, Dan Severn was fighting in MMA events you'd never heard of. right? And I'm sure he was fighting for a couple $1,000s and, $3, $4, $5,000. It's pretty sad when you consider what a dominant force he was in early MMA. One other thing that is a problem here is that fighters are often surrounded by yes men. There are people pushing them to fight. There's coaches, there's managers, there's sparring partners. They all have a vested interest in telling that guy, no, 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 just train hard, just do it. I mean, they might have a financial benefit. They might be taking a cut of that fighter's winnings, or even the amount of money he makes when he loses. They have a financial vested interest in that fighter doing well or continuing to fight. Doing well would be great, but the most important thing, ultimately, if you follow the incentives, is that that fighter keeps on fighting. For a gym owner or for a coach, there's a certain prestige that comes from having fighters underneath you. Yeah, I got 4 guys fighting in an MMA event next weekend. That boosts that person's self-esteem. It's a cool thing to tell your friends. It boosts his status, but it might not be what's best for those fighters. You don't want to be that tomato can who keeps on fighting, who starts going from a record of, 3 wins for every 1 loss to 2 wins to every 2 losses, 50-50, and then starts going down from there. I submit to you that once you got a record that's anywhere near 50-50, it's time to pull the chute. And of course, that implies that you've got some other way to make a living. So that's one more thing for anyone wanting to make a living in MMA to do, in addition to the conditioning, in addition to the kickboxing, in addition to the wrestling, in addition to the jiu-jitsu, in addition to the full MMA sparring, is be thinking about their life after MMA. And that's a high bar to clear, because being an MMA fighter is a full-time job. But hopefully you got some kind of escape hatch. I mean, a lot of guys think they want to open a gym. That's the sort of the default plan for a lot of MMA fighters. It does work if you have the temperament to teach kids classes, if you have the temperament to figure out Facebook and Instagram and, post about your upcoming January get back in shape kickbox exercise classes. If you think you can handle that, then running a gym certainly is an idea. Just to bring this back to the Chuck Liddell thing, just to finish and alienate people who are going to accuse me of being an armchair quarterback here. We got to remember that he was untouchable. He was light heavyweight champion for a reason. He had a ton of knockouts to his name for a reason. But you got to remember that the last fight he fought, before he fought Tito, he got knocked out by Rich Franklin, who had a broken arm, who knocked him out with that broken arm. So at this point, you could see, I wasn't in the ring. I didn't get punched by Rich Franklin. I'm assuming that the glass jaw phenomenon had already been developed. A glass jaw doesn't have anything to do with the jaw. It has to do with the brain's susceptibility to getting knocked out. Lots and lots of fighters go through this. They start out being able to take a punch. They might have a motto of take a punch to give a punch, or take 2 punches to give a punch. Just go in there. I'm tough. The Rocky Balboa model, where every single punch lands and you take one, you give one, you take one, you give one. Well, eventually, that ability of your brain to not say, okay, lights out, you're going unconscious, goes away. That's a glass jaw. Chuck Liddell clearly had a glass jaw back when he was still fighting in the UFC, back when he was fighting guys like Rich Franklin. It hasn't gotten any better. Glass jaws don't go away. I know one boxing trainer used to be one of these get in there and trade and take one to give one. He can't even spar now with headgear. He gets a light tap on the head, he gets a splitting headache. Basically, his concussion comes right back. These things don't get better. I've never heard of a fighter curing themselves of a glass jaw. So when should you retire? That's a totally individual decision. I can't make that decision for you. I'm so paranoid about brain damage that I would probably urge fighters to retire before they started. I think it's a really dangerous thing, but I recognize that some people are driven to do this. But if you start seeing that your reaction times are going down, if you start seeing that your loss to win ratio is going in the wrong direction, if you start taking more punches, if you seem to be affected by concussion more than you did earlier in your career, right? Earlier in your career, you could come out of a sparring session, feel fine. Now you take a couple of shots and you got a splitting headache. Man, it is time to pull the chute. It is time to eject from the sport. And hopefully, you've got some kind of exit strategy. You've got some other way to pay the bills. You've got some other way to make a living. You've got some other way to stay active in the sport without actually getting in there and getting banged up every couple of months in the ring and every day in the sparring ring. It's really not good for you. Do it if you have to, but don't keep doing it past the point of no return. And the trouble is, point of no return, different for everyone. That is the paradox. It's like making toast. What's the perfect way to make toast? Cook it till it burns and then 2 minutes less. Unfortunately, at this point, MMA is the same way. We can't scan your brain without killing you to see where your CTE status is at. Maybe one day something like that will exist and your doctor will be able to say, hey, Chris, you've got 13 nanomoles per liter of the protein that's associated with CTE. That's our threshold. You got to quit. Maybe one day it'll be that simple. It's not that simple yet. So you got to quit almost before you start getting to those symptoms. And that's a really tough call to make. Man, my heart goes out to the fighters who have to make that decision. And it's not an easy one, but it's a really, really important one.